The submersible dipped below the surface at 6:42 in the morning, and for the first 11 seconds, everything visible on the monitor looked more like glass than water. You could make out the aluminum frame of the craft mirrored beneath it, ropes trailing off like dark threads, sunlight driving straight down in solid golden shafts that seemed to stretch without end. Lake Tahoe is well known for that kind of clarity. On a calm day, you can lean over the edge of a boat and watch a coin you've dropped flash and spin for what feels like an eternity before it disappears from sight. And that particular morning, as the vehicle began making its way downward, the people gathered around the control screen up on deck went silent because every one of them understood where it was headed. Down beyond the depth where any diver could safely go, down toward a lake bed that, according to well over a century of stories, either didn't exist at all or was filled with the departed. Because that is what makes this lake unlike any other. It carries two legends heavier than the water itself. The first is that Tahoe has no true bottom, that somewhere out in its center, the rock just falls away into a shaft connecting to other lakes, other rivers, perhaps even the ocean, that anything swallowed by it is gone for good. The second legend is far more unsettling. For decades, people have quietly passed around the idea that the cold, dark depths of Tahoe function as a flawless resting place, that bodies descend into that freezing water and never decay. That figures from the casino era. People who disappeared under troubling circumstances are said to rest down there in their suits, hair still neat, expressions peaceful, standing upright in the darkness, like a gallery of wax figures waiting to be discovered. And the most well-known version of that story, the one told around campfires, at waterfront bars, and across 1,000 online threads, involves a legendary diver who came back up from the deepest part of this very lake, looking pale and shaken, refusing to say what he had encountered, offering only that the world was not prepared for what lay down there. For 100 years, nobody could prove any of it. The lake held onto its secrets the way it always does, cold, still, and completely beyond reach. But that was all about to shift, because for the very first time, machines were descending all the way to the bottom, while cameras captured every moment. What those cameras recorded genuinely did change things, just not quite in the direction the old legends had suggested. Let's talk about what this lake actually is, because the honest truth turns out to be far more astonishing than any piece of folklore. And that truth explains precisely why those stories took root in the first place. Lake Tahoe sits elevated within the Sierra Nevada, running along the border shared by California and Nevada, nestled inside a basin shaped by geological faults and smoothed over centuries by ancient glaciers. Standing at the shoreline, it seems almost peaceful. A vast blue mirror surrounded by pine trees and granite rock with ski slopes climbing behind the sandy beaches. But that calm surface tells a misleading story about the sheer scale of what lies beneath it. Tahoe ranks among the deepest lakes found anywhere on the continent. At its most profound measured point, the lake bed rests roughly 1,645 feet below the waterline. Say that figure out loud slowly, and it still barely sinks in, so try approaching it from another angle. The Empire State Building, measured from the sidewalk right up to the tip of its antenna, stands around 1,454 feet tall. Lower that entire skyscraper into the deepest section of Lake Tahoe, and its very top would remain nearly 200 feet below the surface. You could stack it up, place someone on the rooftop, and they would never once break through to open air. Or consider the Eiffel Tower, 1,000 feet of iron framework dominating the Parisian skyline. Drop it into Tahoe, and it wouldn't even manage to reach 2/3 of the way down. That is simply how much water exists here. Something in the range of 39 trillion gallons of it, enough to blanket the entire state of California more than a foot deep. This is not a lake in the way a quiet summer pond qualifies as a lake. It is closer to a compact, frigid freshwater sea, generating its own weather patterns, its own currents, and its own suffocating pressure deep in the darkness below. And it is precisely that darkness down below that matters most. As that survey vessel kept descending through those golden shafts of light, something started appearing on the monitor that would make anyone who has ever floated in a warm ocean feel genuinely uneasy. The gold faded, the blue grew richer, and the temperature reading along the edge of the screen, which had begun at a comfortable 60-something degrees near the summer surface, started to drop, and then it stopped dropping and simply held steady. This is the part of Tahoe that gave birth to the legends, and every bit of it is absolutely real. In the upper layer, the lake warms through summer and chills through winter, behaving just like water anywhere else on Earth. But there is a threshold somewhere beyond 300 feet past, which the changing seasons lose all meaning whatsoever. Below that boundary, the water rests at a nearly constant temperature throughout the entire year, hovering just over 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which fresh water reaches its greatest density and weight and therefore settles and stays put. It does not warm come July. It does not freeze come January. It simply remains in a state of endless, motionless cold. In that perpetual and total darkness below, roughly 700 feet, sunlight has vanished completely, not faint, completely gone. A camera sent down there sees absolutely nothing until it switches on its own illumination, and even then, the beam only cuts a narrow passage of visibility through an ink-black void extending in every direction. And here is precisely why the story of Preserved remains sounds so persuasive to anyone who learns the physics behind it. In warm, oxygen-rich water full of bacteria, things fall apart quickly. Wood decays, metal corrodes, organic matter breaks down within days. But in cold like this, hovering near freezing, perfectly still, and starved of oxygen, that entire process slows to almost nothing. Bacteria that depend on warmth and air can barely operate. Decomposition does not halt entirely, but it stretches across timescales that no longer feel intuitive or logical. And so the belief took hold that whatever sinks into the deep cold of Tahoe simply does not decay the way it naturally should. That a shoe, a vessel, a human form could rest on that pitch-black floor for decades or even centuries looking much the same as the moment the water claimed them. It is an unsettling thought, and it carries just enough truth to make it impossible to simply dismiss. So the storytellers ran with it. They took the real depth, the real cold, the real preservation, and constructed an entire mythology on top of it. A mythology of upright remains and undisturbed clothing, and a diver too shaken to put words to what he encountered. For generations, nobody could go down there to verify any of it. The sheer depth alone made it a place that lived in the imagination rather than in the realm of evidence. But imagination has a way of solidifying into something people will swear, up and down, is fact. And by the time the survey vehicles finally made their descent, a good portion of the region was convinced there was a burial ground waiting somewhere in that darkness. The most well-known piece of that mythology has a specific name tied to it, one of the most celebrated names in the entire history of ocean exploration. And to grasp why that particular story simply will not fade away, you have to appreciate how much weight a single sentence carries when it is placed in the mouth of exactly the right person. The story holds that sometime during the 1970s, at the very peak of his fame, the legendary French explorer and filmmaker Jacque Cousteau brought a submersible vessel out to Lake Tahoe. That he went down alone, or very nearly so, into that near-freezing darkness, past the point where any ordinary diver could survive, all the way toward a floor that no human eyes had ever seen, and that when he surfaced again, he was not quite the same person who had gone under. He looked pale, he had gone quiet. Something had deeply unsettled a man who had spent his entire life gazing into the unknown without ever once looking away. And when someone eventually asked him what he had encountered down there, he reportedly gave the answer that has been passed around campfire circles and internet forums alike for the better part of half a century. The world, he is said to have replied, isn't ready for what's down there. It is a perfect line. Read it aloud and feel what it does to you. It tells you nothing directly, yet implies absolutely everything. Not a single object gets described, and still your mind races to fill that silence with whatever terror lives inside you. Bodies, creatures, horrors of your own making. It takes a perfectly ordinary cold lake and turns it into a locked vault of forbidden things, guarded only by one man's refusal to speak. If Cousteau of all people, was too rattled to put words to what he saw, then whatever was down there had to exist well outside the boundaries of normal dread. That one sentence built more of Tahoe's dark reputation than any documented incident ever managed to. It became the cornerstone. Everything else, the upright corpses, the untouched suits, the victims of the mob, all of it hung from that single line. And this is the point where the survey of this story needs to pause and be straight with you, because what comes next changes the direction of everything that follows. That quote, the one the entire legend rests on, has no verifiable origin, none at all. Go looking for the moment Cousteau actually said it. A recording, a transcript, a printed interview, a dated page of any kind, you will find nothing solid. It gets attributed endlessly, but never sourced. It drifts from one retelling to the next, picking up drama along the way, and yet nobody can identify the moment those words actually left his mouth. There is no confirmed record that Cousteau ever descended into the deepest section of Lake Tahoe at all. His own family members have spent decades quietly challenging the story, and still it refuses to die, because a powerful line needs no source to travel. It only needs to be repeated. That matters. It matters more than people want to admit, because it reveals something essential about the entire mythology surrounding this place. The single most famous piece of evidence for the horrors beneath Tahoe is a sentence that may never have actually been spoken by the person it's credited to. Pull that cornerstone free, and you are forced to examine everything else attached to it through a much more skeptical lens. Not because the lake isn't genuinely deep, it is. Not because the cold water doesn't preserve things, it does. But the leap from frigid preserving depths to a standing army of the undead was never supported by evidence. It was carried forward by storytelling alone. And once you recognize that, you begin to crave what the storytellers never possessed. You start wanting to actually go and look. For the vast majority of the lake's existence, that simply wasn't possible. Understanding precisely why is what gives the survey the feeling of a genuine turning point, because the very conditions that nourish the legend are the same ones that keep human beings away. Deep diving anywhere carries serious risk. Deep diving here falls into its own particular category of danger, stacking its hazards in ways that catch even seasoned divers off guard. First comes the sheer depth. The floor of the deepest basin drops well past 1,000 feet. Recreational scuba becomes life-threatening long before that point, and most divers have no real business going beyond 130 feet, where nitrogen starts working on the brain the way a slow sedative would. Push further down, and the pressure closes in around you. The gases in your bloodstream grow treacherous, and every additional foot multiplies the precision and time required to surface in one piece. Then there is the cold to contend with. That near-freezing water sitting below the thermocline doesn't simply chill you, it pulls warmth from a human body with a kind of ruthless efficiency. Even sealed inside a dry suit, time spent in that darkness becomes a quiet countdown. And layered over both of those, there is a factor most people never consider: elevation. Lake Tahoe rests more than 6,000 feet above sea level. The air up there is thinner, and the physics of pressure and dissolved gas that every dive table is built around shift in response. A dive that would be unremarkable along the coast becomes a calculation with a much tighter margin for error when the surface itself sits high in the mountains, depth, cold, and altitude wound together like a braid. It is a place almost purpose-built to shut the living out and leave its floor unseen. So for generation after generation, the bottom of Tahoe remained exactly where the legend needed it to stay. In the realm of imagination, such things remain beyond verification. You could hold any belief about it, since nobody could venture down there and challenge you. And that is exactly the void that machines were designed to fill. When a human body cannot endure the journey downward, you send something with nothing physical to sacrifice. You send sonar, pulses of sound launched into the darkness, measured as they return. Each echo that comes back represents a single data point, and gathered by the millions, those points can be assembled into a map of a shape no human eye has ever fully witnessed. And you send remotely operated vehicles, tethered robotic craft trailing cables all the way up to a vessel on the surface, carrying lights and cameras and instruments down into the cold on your behalf, transmitting everything they observe back up the line to a row of glowing monitors where people sit warm and comfortable and watch. That is the quiet revolution sitting at the core of this whole story. Not a courageous diver, not a submersible faring a wide-eyed explorer, a methodical, unhurried, unglamorous sweep, a survey tracing grid lines back and forth across the entire basin the way a farmer works a field, charting every inch of a floor that legend had long insisted could not be charted, because it supposedly did not exist. The people behind it were not searching for remains. They were doing science, mapping the shape of the basin, examining its slopes and sediment, coming to understand the lake as something alive and connected. But whether or not that was their intention, the moment those pulses began returning clean, measurable echoes from a solid floor, they had already started pulling apart the oldest myth of all. And as the first vehicle slipped beneath the impossibly clear surface and began making its way down, the monitors in the control room brightened with an image that opened in a deceptively pure and luminous blue. A blue so vivid and clean, it almost appeared manufactured. The kind of breathtaking clarity that has made Tahoe celebrated for as long as people have been putting words to it. The water on the monitors in those first 10, 20, 30 feet barely resembled water at all. It looked like glass. The ROV's frame threw a shadow across the boulders beneath it, and the operators could pick out individual pebbles, could watch ribbons of light shimmer across pale granite sand the way a net drapes over the floor of a swimming pool. Someone in the control room said softly that you could read a newspaper down there, and for those first 30 feet, that was nearly accurate. But clarity is one thing, and depth is another, and the two behave in completely different ways the further down you travel. The vehicle continued its descent, thrusters humming along the tether, and the monitors began shifting in a way that was gradual enough to seem beautiful and quick enough to feel unsettling. Bar music. That bright sunlit blue thickened and deepened. The pebbles lost their crispy outlines. Colors started dropping out of the image one at a time, the way they always do beneath the surface. The reds and oranges went first, draining out of everything until the scene was painted entirely in greens and blues, and then even those began to fade. The depth readout in the corner of the screen climbed upward with a quiet, mechanical patience that no one in that room could stop watching. 100 feet, 200. The sunlight that had made the surface so brilliant was now a distant memory somewhere far above, a faint pale ceiling that grew smaller with every meter of cable fed over the side of the vessel. By 300 feet, the ROV's own lights were carrying the entire load. The camera pushed a wedge of white light into water that had turned the deep ink-touched blue of early evening. And beyond that wedge, there was nothing. Not quite darkness, but the complete absence of anything recognizable. This is the boundary the old stories were shaped around. This is where the refrigerator effect takes hold, where the temperature settles into that steady, unchanging cold that holds constant no matter the season, where the pressure has already compressed the margin for any unprotected person down to almost nothing. Right there, in that murky transitional zone, the survey captured the first detail that genuinely brought the entire room to a standstill. Not wreckage, not sediment playing tricks, trees. They appeared first on the sonar returns, and then under the floodlights of the ROV, unmistakable in their form, upright, rooted, their trunks climbing from the lake floor, as though the water surrounding them were nothing but open air. Some had shed their branches across the long centuries, others still carried ghostly skeletal limbs stretching upward into the darkness. They stood the way a forest stands, spaced as forests naturally space themselves, anchored in the very ground where they had once taken root. And all of this sat 300 feet beneath a surface that pleasure boats crossed on lazy summer afternoons. Music. For a moment, nobody in that room made a sound, and honestly, it's easy to understand why. There is something deeply unsettling about encountering a standing tree at the bottom of a lake. A log drifting in shallow water is one thing. The mind processes it without much trouble and moves on. But a tree that remains rooted, still vertical, still occupying the precise location where it once stretched towards sunlight, that tells a different story entirely. That is a whole landscape that was swallowed by rising water without a single thing being knocked loose or displaced, and the frigid, sterile, low oxygen conditions that old legends had long tied to the preservation of remains had, as it turned out, done something far more measurable. Those same conditions had kept the trunks remarkably intact across an extraordinary stretch of time. When samples were eventually sent for dating, the results came back in the range of thousands of years, 6,000 by certain estimates, wood that had been standing beneath the water since long before the pyramids were ever constructed, and that discovery raised a question the survey could measure in physical terms but couldn't fully resolve. A question that hangs over the entire basin once you're aware those trees are sitting down there, because a tree simply cannot grow underwater. For those trees to have grown at all, the surface level of Tahoe must once have rested hundreds of feet lower than it does today, low enough that this stretch of ground had once been open forest, breathing fresh air and catching mountain light. Which tells you that at some point, the lake's surface climbed to a level that would have swallowed a modern city's skyline whole. The unsettling thing isn't that the water climbed. Water does that. The unsettling thing is how gently it must have happened. A violent surge, a rushing wall of water, a sudden catastrophic rise tears trees apart, pulls them from the earth, knocks them flat, and tangles them into wreckage. It does not leave a forest standing perfectly upright. Whatever lifted Tahoe up over those trees did it slowly enough enough, or strangely enough, that the woodland simply ceased living and remained precisely where it had always stood, a submerged forest holding its position in the dark. The survey could show you that it had happened. It could not offer you any real comfort about exactly how. So the monitors held that image, the pale trunks, the outstretched limbs, the undisturbed sand settled between them. And then the survey did what surveys do. It moved on. The thrusters hummed back to life. The depth readout started climbing again, and the drowned forest drifted out of frame and back into the darkness where it had been waiting for 6,000 years. 400 feet, 500. The water had become total night, and the only sensory world remaining was the one the machine itself created. The white cone of the lights, the green glow of the sonar display, the numbers ticking over, and the faint, steady rhythm of the tether feeding out behind it. Back in that control room, warm and dry and brightly lit, it was easy to forget for whole minutes at a stretch that everything they were watching existed somewhere that would be fatal to an unprotected person in less time than it takes to finish a single sentence. The ordinary comfort of those monitors pressed right up against the extraordinary hostility of what they were actually showing. Somewhere beyond 600 feet, the sonar operators leaned forward. They had been running clean grid lines, watching the floor resolve tile by tile into the very first genuine map anyone had ever drawn of this basin. And then the readings shifted. The smooth, consistent signature of settled sediment had broken apart into a scatter of firmer echoes, small, distinct shapes clustered right where the clean data suggested there should be nothing but silt. A cluster of hard returns on a sonar screen does not tell you a story on its own. It might be rock, it might be a collapsed shelf of stone. It could be any one of 100 completely unremarkable things a lake floor gathers over 10,000 years, but it could also be within the framework that every old Tahoe legend had conditioned people to dread, something else altogether. And for however long it took to guide the vehicle in for a closer look, nobody standing in that room was prepared to say out loud what shapes sitting 600 feet down, grouped together on the floor of a lake with a well-known reputation for keeping its dead, might actually turn out to be. So they kept quiet, and they sent the lights descending toward the cluster, and they watched the dark water surrender its outlines, one pale shape at a time. What those lights revealed when the ROV finally positioned itself above that cluster and steadied against the current was not a body. It was not 9 figures arranged in some deliberate formation, and it was not a solitary man in a 1940s suit standing perfectly upright with his eyes wide open and a pocket watch pressing against his chest. The pale cones settled, the sediment caught the glow, and the hard returns resolved themselves into shapes that were almost embarrassingly mundane. Bottles, cans, a tangled mass of what had probably once been fishing equipment fused now into a single knotted clump by decades of cold and pressure. A tire, the edge of something rusted flat and too corroded to identify. Just refuse. 600 feet beneath the surface of one of the clearest, most carefully preserved lakes on the continent, the survey had turned its lights toward the darkest legend Tahoe had ever produced, and it had found rubbish. You could feel it in the control room, that specific kind of silence that follows a long-held breath finally let go. Not quite disappointment, something harder to name than that, because the machine had just accomplished the one thing that no legend could ever withstand. It had looked directly and completely at the place the stories claimed held the departed, and it had found nothing but what the living had discarded there. This was the moment the entire enterprise shifted, and it shifted quietly, the way genuine revelations tend to do. There was no leaked footage. There was no desperate call to any authority, no location sealed off, no cluster of shadowy human shapes that some diver would murmur about for the remainder of his days. There was a detailed sonar map assembled line by patient line, and there were hours upon hours of ROV recordings, and together they communicated something that 100 years of folklore had never been willing to accept. Tahoe is not without a bottom. It has a floor sitting roughly 1,645 feet down, and that floor has now been charted in greater detail than most people could describe their own neighborhoods. And that floor does not hold a field of perfectly preserved figures suspended upright in the cold. The refrigerator effect is genuine enough. The water down there truly is dark and bitterly cold, and deeply resistant to decay. But the Cathedral of the Dead, that legend had constructed inside it, simply was not present. The cameras swept every location where remains were supposed to rest, and found only lake bed in return. And here is the thing about the man in the diving suit and the 9 figures and the body with the ticking watch and Cousteau surfacing pale and trembling with a warning he could never bring himself to share. When you actually go searching for the origin of those stories, you discover that the trail dissolves before you ever reach anything solid. The famous line, suggesting the world is not prepared for what lies down there, has no confirmed source. No recording, no interview, no document that anyone can actually point toward. The family most closely connected to that legendary diver has spent decades insisting it never took place, that he did not descend into Tahoe's deepest darkness and resurface a haunted man. That the quote itself is a ghost, one that carries no body of its own. The legend, as it turns out, resembles the very remains it speaks of. Everybody knows somebody who claims to have witnessed it, yet nobody can actually produce it. But the survey did uncover something real. And that part hits with a weight no creature of myth ever could, because it is factual and because it belongs to all of us. Across the mapped lake bed of Tahoe, from the shallows stretching out into deep blue water and down into the cold dark, the cameras captured debris, not a curiosity, not a single stray container. A striking, accumulating spread of human-made waste, glass and aluminum and plastic and sunken refuse, decades worth of it, resting quietly on the sediment of a lake that people travel hundreds of miles just to stand beside and call untouched. The same cold stillness that legends promised would keep bodies preserved had instead kept our rubbish perfectly intact, holding it readable and clear on the floor of one of the most breathtaking lakes on the entire continent. That is the reality. The machines pulled up the tether. Tahoe is not a resting place for the departed. It is a resting place for what we never bothered to take back with us. And in its own understated way, that is more troubling than any ghost story. A creature of darkness can be feared from a comfortable distance. A field of preserved remains is a legend that demands nothing more than a chill down your spine. But a lake bed scattered with bottles and cans is a reflection. And it does not allow you to turn away, because every single piece resting down there once passed through hands like yours, on a boat or a shoreline on a perfectly ordinary summer afternoon. The survey that set out to confirm Tahoe's darkest myths ended up confirming something far simpler and far more uncomfortable, that the lake has been quietly absorbing our carelessness across generations and holding on to every last piece. That discovery never disappeared into a filing drawer. It became the very foundation for everything that came next. The same mapping that guided the cleanup effort, sending divers and machines back beneath the surface, wasn't about searching for the departed. It was about hauling up what the living had left behind, bottle by bottle, tire by tire, from a lake bed that, for the very first time, someone could genuinely look at. The myths faded away, but the responsibility those myths had been quietly covering up did not. So the old questions can finally be set aside. The lake is not without a bottom. Its floor has been measured. It is not some standing graveyard of upright figures. It is a graveyard of the things we threw away. The Cousteau warning was never actually said by the man it gets credited to. The submerged forest is real and genuinely remarkable, still standing in silent formation after 6,000 years. And the honest answer to how it ended up there is simply that nobody fully understands it yet, which is a far more worthwhile mystery than an invented one, because it happens to be true. And someone reading this might one day be part of figuring it out. The Washoe held this basin as sacred ground long before any of the later stories ever existed, and their deep respect for its waters reads very differently now, less like old superstition and more like the earliest and most straightforward instruction anyone ever offered about this place, that it deserves to be looked after. The depths of Lake Tahoe concealed no remains and no creature lurking in the dark. What they held were trees we never planted, a past we cannot yet explain, and the rubbish we absolutely did leave behind. The cameras descended expecting a legend and returned carrying something more like a reflection. So I want to hear from you. Did you grow up thinking Lake Tahoe had no bottom, or that something unsettling was waiting in its cold, dark depths? And now that the floor has been mapped and the truth turns out to be litter rather than legend, what do you genuinely think we should do about the waste a beloved lake has been absorbing for over 100 years? Let me know down in the comments. And if you're ready to keep diving where no one else can go, hit subscribe. There's always another deeper level waiting to be explored.